It's important, but I don't want to see it. That's it, in a nutshell. The opinion of the world about breastfeeding in public. But what does mainstream media has to do with all this? Well, it seems like that quite a lot. Today, my guest is Dr. Katie Foss, professor of media studies at the Middle Tennessee State University. She conducted a study where one group of participants watched a TV scene showing breastfeeding in public, while the other group was watching a scene showing breastfeeding in private. She wanted to find out whether acceptance towards breastfeeding would be stronger in the group who watched it on TV. We'll talk about the results and we'll talk about the impact that mainstream media has on forming public perception. We will talk about also how all of this influences breastfeeding decision and what media messages should be sent out to change that perception. The topic is vast and we will try to cover as much as we can, but if you would like to get the full picture, then I recommend that you get Dr. Foss's book called Breastfeeding and Media, which is a fascinating read. The link is in the description, and now enjoy the talk. I am here today with Dr. Katie Foss. Katie, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here, thanks.
Breastfeeding in public is almost absent in entertainment media. Breastfeeding is portrayed as an intimate affair between mom and baby in the privacy of their home or in their hospital. I find your study very important because you show that participants who watch a scene from a TV show about public breastfeeding do develop more support towards it compared to those who watch the scene showing private breastfeeding. Could you explain in layman's terms what these results mean?
Sure. Well, first of all, people are already more in favor of private breastfeeding. So I think that's part of the reason why there was a shift between participants who viewed one type of scene versus another. The key really here is to have this sympathy for the characters. So have fictional entertainment scenes that create a position for the audience in which they identify with the characters. They feel badly that the main characters were ridiculed for breastfeeding their own babies in public, which is very much a natural process, right? And then this sympathy causes them to change their position to be more supportive of public breastfeeding.
Right, yeah, that was actually a very interesting finding of the results, that the participants were influenced by their sympathy towards the characters. Does that mean that mothers who breastfeed their babies don't have yet enough sympathy in the public eye? Or does it mean that the media should only really focus on portraying breastfeeding together with a character who is liked? So don't let any villains breastfeed on TV.
I would like to see more villains breastfeed on TV. Actually, what it means is that we need more representations. We need more diverse representations showing all kinds of different characters breastfeeding, both in the privacy of their own homes as well as different public spaces and across characters, so that you don't just remember one character that breastfed once, but instead it's just the thing that you do and it's normalized across both heroes and villains as well.
The other outcome of the study was that support will be higher in a more recent period compared to an earlier period, just because of the growing social acceptance of public breastfeeding, which is great news. Does it mean that there already exists a high level of acceptance towards breastfeeding in public?
Actually, I would put a little set of stipulations with that. So in general, if we take, and my study focused on primarily childless college students, right, reflecting the general public, we take a group of just regular people, they tend to be somewhat favorable towards breastfeeding as an abstract concept. And what they're picturing is breastfeeding women, primarily white women, because that's what the representations that we tend to see, breastfeeding their own babies that are newborns in their own homes. So when we shake things up by taking them out of that circumstance, then that's when we have less support. So what we need, again, is not fewer representations, because there's already a base level of support, but even more representations to the point that it's normalized for any women to breastfeed in any space, and different ages of kids too, beyond that newborn stage.
Yes, to give it more variety, so the audience members can identify with the actual characters in this respect.
Mm-hmm.
More than half of the 375 participants were males, which is a great turnout for the study. Was there any notable difference in the results between the male and female participants?
So we didn't notice statistically significant difference in gendered responses, other than kind of that statistical breakdown. Male participants actually were slightly more supportive of breastfeeding than their female counterparts. But again, it wasn't enough of a gap to make a claim either way.
And does it mean that their support for breastfeeding or support breastfeeding in public?
A difference not much of a difference in either one. We actually speculate that it was because male participants have thought less about it.
Right.
They're more apathetic. They don't care either way. And that's why, whereas female participants might see themselves in those roles and might feel uncomfortable about it. But it's really critical that men support breastfeeding just as much as women, as we know that the number one factor in whether or not a woman continues breastfeeding after the initial time is partner support.
Yes.
So having supportive people around you makes a huge difference, both in your own home as well as in public. And who's working? Men, women, non-binary folks across the gender spectrum. People are in public and are making judgments about women breastfeeding.
Yes, and that's very true that, say, while the media played a very good role, as you mentioned, in educating about the benefits of breastfeeding, it still portrays it as the mom's role, the mom's choice, the mom's assignment, the mom's responsibility, not as a matter of social responsibility. So you mentioned that more media messages are needed to shift that perception. What would you recommend for the messages to be, and who should be responsible doing them?
Everyone should be responsible, because to be constructed as a choice is problematic, and that we shouldn't view breastfeeding as is this or that, like, are you going to cloth diaper your baby or use disposable diapers? It's just not the same thing, because it's vital to public health that more babies are breastfed. And with that absolutely comes this culture of supportive climate that we need for breastfeeding mothers. So not only do we need those single episodes of TV shows that focus on breastfeeding, usually with some kind of catchy breastfeeding related, title to the episode, but we also just need it to be the thing that characters do when they have a baby. You have a baby, the baby is breastfed across race and ethnicity, across the woman's age and profession, across her status in terms of, like, is she married? Is she single? Who's supporting her? It's just the thing that is automatically done. And to be so pervasive that you can't just think of one episode, but you think of, oh, of course, they had a baby and the baby is breastfed. And the baby is breastfed in private and in public. And it's just not a big deal. Just like you would do anything else, any other kind of storyline that suggests you had a baby, put breastfeeding as part of it.
That's right. One of the questions for participants in the study was, I feel comfortable seeing a woman breastfeed her child using a cover, and they had to rate their level of agreement or disagreement. And then right under it, there's another question asking, I feel comfortable seeing a woman breastfeed her child without a cover. And I think these two questions touch on a fundamental pain point about breastfeeding in public. So I was very curious, was there any difference in the answers to these two questions, something notable?
Yes, participants are, and both in that study and in general, because there's other studies that support it as well, are more comfortable with covered up breastfeeding. Now, anybody who's ever breastfed knows that it's really difficult to maintain, to only breastfeed under a cover, especially if you want to have success after that newborn stage. And to meet all the recommendations set by the major health organizations, you have to breastfeed longer than 3 months or 6 months, or past that stage where a baby's going to be happy breastfeeding under a cover. Once they get squirmy and they start kicking and they start reaching up, it's just not feasible to cover up numerous times a day and always have that be your go-to. And now some women do prefer to cover up, and more power to you if that's how you prefer it. The problem is that discomfort with the public when it's really not their concern. It's not their position to judge. It's just like judging someone if they're using a straw or not. It's not your business. And so that this has even become like a position for which to criticize women is incredibly troublesome.
Right. Yeah. And I can totally hear what you say, because these were my notes for this as well, that my baby definitely had none of it. He was fidgety. He wouldn't have it if I tried to cover myself up.
Mm-hmm.
He just wouldn't breastfeed. And I think this information is not really out there
Mm-hmm.
for the public to know, that it's not possible to breastfeed on the cover because the baby just wouldn't have it.
Right.
So it's not necessarily a choice that we don't want to cover up. But I have to say something for the other side as well, because from their perspective, those who feel embarrassed seeing, I mean, breast is so much linked to sex. Those who feel embarrassed seeing a breastfeeding mother's breast, a simple get over it just might not do the trick for them. It's difficult to change how you feel about something on command. And I think empathy towards both sides is necessary here. And I was wondering, do you have ideas what message the media can help in that, again, to soften that awkwardness, soften that feeling of embarrassment for the other side?
So I also think that part of this is it's part of the issues with the cultural climate as well, because I don't think we've had enough accurate representations of women breastfeeding without a cover. That when people read statements like "I feel comfortable seeing a woman breastfeed without a cover," I don't think they always know what they're thinking of, right? Because as a lot of breastfeeding mothers know, it actually can be pretty discreet and tends to be pretty discreet. And it may not be something that other people around you are even aware that you're doing, especially if you've been breastfeeding for a long time. So I do think part of this is, again, the absence of realistic depictions contributes to people's discomfort, that what they're picturing is not the same as what's really happening.
Yes, I think that's very true.
And maybe documentaries or more instances in which actors breastfeed their own kids, because a lot of TV shows have used actors with their own babies in scenes, right? So they're breastfeeding, and that could help to normalize what this is. Again, taking it away. I also think that if you ask people, are you comfortable with this? They might be more comfortable than they're willing to admit, because perhaps it feels awkward in a survey to answer, I feel comfortable, as if you're saying, I really want to see this. And not caring and wanting to see it are two very different things.
Yes, that's true. People do kind of think about their answers as well, how they
Mm-hmm.
come across
Right.
with the answer as opposed to what they actually feel.
Right.
The media, in your book, you mentioned there's a whole chapter about
Mm-hmm.
different scenes in the entertainment media, which was a very interesting chapter to read. Humor in entertainment media is generally a great way to break awkwardness about a topic, and does a great deal towards acceptance. But I was wondering, could that also have an opposite effect? Would mothers might feel laughed at? Do you see any effects like that?
They could, depending on how you construct a humorous scene. So we have a lot of representations now that do have the breastfeeding scenes. And if the humor is directed at, for example, the partner or at the person ridiculing the person breastfeeding, then it could work in a very positive way, right? Just say that we're laughing at the person who's trying to criticize someone doing something that's totally normal. That's very different than ridiculing the woman herself and having that be the butt of the joke.
Yeah. And in the same way, there are also scenes where breastfeeding is shown as deviant or wrong. I have to mention the famous scene, the famous Game of Thrones breastfeeding scene, where the 7-year-old is breastfed in full view, sitting on the throne. What's the overall impact of scenes like that?
Well, obviously that could be an issue, but where it's an issue, I would say, isn't so much in a scene like that. It's the lack of all of breastfeeding depictions of kids between a baby and the next in line for the throne, or the kid who's like 13 years old. What we don't see a lot of is older babies breastfeeding, kids who are 2 years old breastfeeding, and seeing that extended breastfeeding represented in a much more realistic way. So I would say that while there again are some issues with the Game of Thrones representation, the bigger issue is all the in between that's not shown.
Exactly. It's the lack of balance.
Absolutely.
This might be a far-fetched thought, but I have to share it with you. I was wondering if that scene actually could have quite the opposite effect, meaning that it's supportive of it, because just imagine the viewers who saw that scene and the next time they walk down in the park, see a mother breastfeeding an infant, wouldn't that look refreshingly normal? So in a twisted way, I wondered if that scene would help normalize breastfeeding, and with that, other extreme messaging might actually help normalize it.
I think it's a kind of double-edged sword, and it'd be difficult to measure because it might reinforce breastfeeding infants, or it might be so disconnected to even the experience of breastfeeding that we might not put it in the same camp. I think that's interesting. I've not studied it, so I cannot make a claim. Although generally in our study, the breastfeeding older kids, which tended to be much older, didn't have a lot of effects on perceptions of breastfeeding. Again, because I think it's so extreme or an outlier that sympathy for the character in a more realistic situation had a much more profound effect.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to mention your book just now that we are talking about it. So you have this book called Breastfeeding and Media, which is a very thorough look at this complex relationship, and full of great ideas and recommendations of how media can do more. So I'm just curious, first of all, why did you write it and who did you write it for?
Well, thank you. So I wrote it as kind of the culmination of my studies on breastfeeding and media. That I had been studying it for more than 10 years, and there's really been a gap in the literature, especially when I wrote the book, studying this relationship when, as we know, media messages are so important in our decision making, both with pregnant women deciding the means of feeding their babies and the extent to which partners support and the extent to which society supports it. It really felt like this needed to be explored in a way that crossed platforms and a way that brought in the history of formula marketing, that brought in cultural climate and all of these different factors that come together to help shape the extent to which a woman is successful in breastfeeding her own child. It's definitely written for both an academic audience as well as a general audience. That all the material in the book is backed by evidence from both historical and contemporary media examples, and that really looks at a larger conversation that needs to continue to happen, which is how can we as a society, how can we as a world come together to support women in this very important public health practice?
I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I like the book, because it really shows how complex the issue is and how many different factors decide and influence mothers. Well, we say choice, but really the result, whether they're gonna breastfeed or not breastfeed, and media plays a very important role in this. I'm glad you mentioned formula marketing, and I really hope that the next time we chat, we will be able to have a discussion, a deeper discussion about that, because it's another very important topic. So with that, I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you. Happy to talk, and happy to talk again.
Thank you so much. Next week, we will make a business case for breastfeeding. My guest, Kim Chalf, and I will talk about why it is in a company's own financial interest to provide lactation support for its employees and how to make it super easy to implement. Make sure you and hopefully your boss listens next Monday.